Sometimes a single choice can define who we truly are beneath the weight of our past. In a world where mercy is seen as weakness, one man must decide if saving a life is worth risking everything he has left. Jarnulf was once a feared Viking warlord whose name brought terror to distant shores. Now he lives alone in exile in the frozen Nordheim valley, cast out by his own people for past bloodshed. On this bitter morning, he finds a young woman dying by the river, her body blue with cold. By ancient law, the weak are left to fate. But something in her eyes stops him. Against everything he was taught, Jarnulf chooses mercy over tradition. He doesn't know this woman holds secrets that could destroy kingdoms. What drove her to the river's deadly embrace? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind carried the scent of pine and coming snow across the Nordheim valley as Jarnulf Ironarm bent over the woman's still form. 7 winters had passed since he'd last touched another human being with gentleness, and his calloused hands trembled as he lifted her from the ice-crusted riverbank. She weighed no more than a child, her bones sharp beneath skin pale as birch bark. His breath misted in the frigid air as he carried her toward his homestead, a crude assemblage of timber and stone wedged into a natural shelter beneath an overhanging cliff. The dwelling had served him well through seasons of isolation, but now it felt inadequate for harboring life so fragile. The broken axe mounted above his door caught the weak winter light. Its ceremonial blade snapped cleanly in two, a reminder of the honor he'd lost and the man he'd once been. Inside, the single room smelled of wood smoke and preserved fish. Jarnulf laid the woman on his sleeping furs near the central fire pit and began the careful work of warming her without shocking her frozen flesh. He'd seen men die from too rapid thawing, their hearts stopping when the blood rushed back to extremities. His large hands moved with surprising delicacy as he rubbed circulation back into her fingers and toes. She was young, perhaps 20 summers, with hair the color of winter wheat and skin marked by old scars along her forearms. These were not the random wounds of accident or misfortune, but deliberate cuts, precise and ritualistic. A vulva's markings, though he'd not seen such things since his youth, when the old ways still held stronger sway over the minds of men. As he worked to save her life, memories rose unbidden from the depths where he'd tried to drown them. Jarnulf Ironarm, they'd called him in the days when his name rang across the northern seas like a bell of doom. He'd been Jarl Magnus's right hand, the giant who stood at the prow of longships and made grown warriors weep at the sight of his approach. Villages had surrendered at the mere rumor of his coming. Kings had paid tribute to avoid his wrath. That man seemed like a stranger now, viewed through the lens of 7 years' exile and reflection. The homestead around him bore little resemblance to the great hall where he'd once feasted. No carved pillars supported a soaring roof. No tapestries displayed his victories. No skalds sang his praises. There was only this stone walls chinked with moss, a roof of overlapping timber, and silence broken only by wind and the woman's labored breathing. He'd built this place with his own hands after the day of his banishment, when Jarl Magnus had pronounced him outlaw for the killing of Bjorn the Red. The ceremony had been brief, but thorough in its humiliation. They'd stripped him of lands, titles, and followers. They'd taken his ceremonial weapons and broken them before the assembled host. The great axe, that had been his father's and his grandfather's before him, snapped like kindling and cast at his feet. "Let none say I am without mercy," Magnus had declared that day. "Jarnulf Ironarm may keep his life, but let him live it far from the company of honorable men. Let the wilderness judge if he deserves better than the death he gave my brother." The crowd had parted as he walked away, their faces careful masks, hiding relief, satisfaction, or in some cases, genuine sorrow. Eric, Magnus's young son, had wept openly. The boy had loved him like an uncle, but blood was blood, and family honor demanded justice for family shame. Jarnulf pulled a wool blanket up to the woman's chin and checked the pulse at her throat, still weak but steady. Her lips had lost their blue tinge, and the shallow rise and fall of her chest seemed less desperate. Whatever had driven her to collapse by the river in the depths of winter, she would live to tell of it. His daily routine had been disrupted by her arrival, but the work of survival continued regardless. He banked the fire with care, adding fuel that would burn slowly through the night. The fish traps down by the river would need checking, and he had snares set along the deer paths that crossed the valley floor. Winter demanded constant vigilance against hunger and cold, and he'd learned to find a kind of peace in the simple rhythms of necessity. The woman stirred as he prepared to leave for his evening rounds, her eyes fluttering open to reveal irises the color of storm clouds. They fixed on his face with startling intensity, as if she saw more than the weathered features of a middle-aged exile. Her lips moved soundlessly, forming words he couldn't catch. Then she was unconscious again, but something in that brief moment of contact had unsettled him in ways he couldn't name. Outside, the valley lay shrouded in the blue twilight of winter. Snow had begun to fall, fat flakes that caught what little light remained and danced on the wind like spirits. Jarnulf checked his traps and found them empty, but the fish weir had caught 2 good-sized trout that would supplement their meal. As he cleaned the catch by the water's edge, he found himself glancing repeatedly toward his homestead, as if expecting to see some sign of the stranger's presence. The truth was that loneliness had become such a constant companion that he'd almost forgotten what it felt like to be in human company. He talked to himself sometimes, and to the ravens that frequented the valley, but actual conversation had become a half-remembered skill. What did one say to a woman who'd nearly died from cold? What questions were proper to ask? The social graces required for such situations had atrophied from disuse. By the time he returned, full dark had settled over the land. The homestead's windows glowed with warm firelight, and smoke rose straight up from the chimney in the still air. Inside, the woman remained unconscious, but her breathing had deepened and her color continued to improve. He prepared a simple meal of fish stew and hard bread, eating his portion in silence while she slept. When she finally woke near midnight, her first word was his name. Jarnulf. Her voice was barely a whisper, hoarse from cold and whatever trials had brought her to his threshold. She spoke it not as a question but as recognition, as if she'd been seeking him specifically. He set down his carving a small wooden cup he'd been shaping to pass the evening hours, and studied her face in the firelight. "You know me?" "I know many things." She struggled to sit up, accepting his assistance with dignity despite her weakness. "I know you didn't kill Bjorn the Red, though you let them believe you did. I know Magnus fears what I might say if I lived to see another spring, and I know the Norns brought me to your door for purposes neither of us yet understand." The wooden cup fell from his numb fingers and rolled across the packed earth floor. 7 years of careful isolation shattered in an instant, replaced by questions that burned like acid in his throat. Who was this woman? How could she know such things? And most frightening of all, what did her knowledge mean for the fragile peace he'd built in this forgotten corner of the world? She watched him process her words, those storm-grey eyes missing nothing of his reaction. When she spoke again, her voice carried the authority of one accustomed to being believed, despite her apparent youth and current vulnerability. "My name is Astrid Truthseer, last daughter of the Ravenswood Volva. I have travelled far to find you, Jarnulf, Ironarm, because the time has come for truth to have its day. But first, I would ask for some of that stew. Death's touch leaves one terribly hungry." As he ladled broth into a wooden bowl and helped her drink, Jarnulf felt the last 7 years of his carefully ordered existence crumbling around him like ice in spring thaw. Whatever this Astrid represented, truth, trouble, or something else entirely, her presence would change everything. The only question was whether that change would bring redemption or destruction, and he was no longer certain there was a difference between the two. Astrid slept through the remainder of the night, but when dawn broke grey and cold across the valley, she was awake and sitting cross-legged on the furs, a bone-handled knife balanced across her knees. The blade was unlike anything Jarnulf had seen, carved from what looked like whale ivory and inscribed with runes that seemed to shift in the firelight. Blood had stained the bone handle, old and dark, speaking of rituals he could only guess at. "That's an interesting piece," he said, settling beside the fire with his morning portion of bread and dried fish. "My vulva's knife," she replied, running her thumb along the flat of the blade. "It belonged to my teacher, and her teacher before that, reaching back to the time when the gods walked among men. The blood you see has never been washed away. It carries the essence of every prophecy spoken over its edge." Jarnulf kept his expression neutral, though skepticism gnawed at him. In his youth, he'd seen enough Sidra workers and rune readers to know that most were clever frauds who told people what they wanted to hear in exchange for silver. A few had possessed genuine knowledge, but even they relied more on careful observation than supernatural insight. Yet something about this woman's quiet confidence unsettled him. "You mentioned prophecy last night," he said carefully. "What exactly do you see when you look into whatever realm vulvas look into?" Astrid set the knife aside and fixed him with those storm-colored eyes. "I see the giant's choice, awakening the sleeping feud. I see blood in the snow and ravens feasting on the proud. I see Magnus riding north with violence in his heart and lies on his tongue. Most clearly of all, I see you standing at a crossroads where mercy and might diverge, and the choice you make will echo through the 9 realms." Despite himself, Jarnulf felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning cold. "Riddles and poetry. If you have something to say, speak plainly." "Very well." Astrid leaned forward, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Magnus knows I escaped his hunters 3 days ago. He knows I carry proof of what really happened the night Bjorn died. He knows that if I reach the spring assembly at Ironhold, his carefully constructed lies will crumble like rotten wood. Even now, he gathers his most loyal men for a final hunt. They will be here before the new moon." The bread in Jarnulf's mouth turned to ash. "How can you possibly know?" "Because I was there that night 7 years ago." Her words fell like hammer blows. "Hidden in the grain stores when Magnus met with Bjorn by the river. I saw your lord strike down his own brother in rage when Bjorn threatened to expose Magnus's dealings with the Danes. I watched him arrange the scene to implicate you. I heard him promise his men rich rewards for their silence." Jarnulf's hands clenched into fists, so tight the knuckles went white. 7 years of exile, 7 years of shame and isolation, 7 years of believing himself guilty of kinslaying, even as he maintained his innocence to the world. The magnitude of the betrayal struck him like a physical blow. "Why?" The word came out as barely more than a growl. "Why didn't you speak? Why let an innocent man suffer?" "Because I was 15 summers old, alone and terrified," Astrid said quietly. "Because Magnus's men scoured the countryside for days afterward, killing anyone who might have witnessed his crime. I fled to the deep forests and spent 3 years learning to survive while Magnus consolidated his power. By the time I was strong enough to act, you had vanished into exile, and Magnus had convinced the world of your guilt. And now the Norns have woven our fates together. My teacher trained me to see the patterns that connect all things. Your exile brought you to this place, to this moment, when my flight from Magnus's hunters would lead me to your door. The gods work in ways that mortal minds struggle to comprehend." Jarnulf stood abruptly and began pacing the confines of the small room. The rational part of his mind rejected her talk of fate and divine intervention, but the pieces fit together too neatly to dismiss. Magnus's quick acceptance of evidence against his most trusted lieutenant, the lack of witnesses to the actual killing, the way his former lord had watched him during the banishment ceremony, not with grief for a fallen friend, but with the calculating gaze of a man ensuring a problem stayed solved. "You said he's coming here," Jarnulf said finally. "How long do we have?" 3 days, perhaps 4 if the snow slows them. Magnus leads them himself, along with Bjorn the tracker and 20 picked men. They'll follow my trail to this valley, and when they find me, she gestured toward the bone knife. There are limits to what even vulva magic can accomplish against armed warriors. Then we run. The mountains have paths only the desperate would attempt in winter. But, no. Astrid's voice carried an authority that stopped him mid-sentence. Running solves nothing. Magnus will hunt me to the ends of the earth because he knows I'm the one person who can destroy him. And you, where would you go? This valley has been your refuge, but it's also become your prison. You cannot reclaim your honor by fleeing from it. My honor died the day I was banished. Your reputation died. Honor is what a man carries in his heart, and yours has never been cleaner than it is now. 7 years ago, you were a killer in service to a corrupt lord. Today, you are a man who risked everything to save a stranger's life. Which version of yourself would you rather die defending? The question hung between them like a blade suspended over both their heads. Jarnulf studied this strange young woman who spoke of fate and prophecy as if they were simple facts, who claimed to hold the key to his vindication while carrying death in her wake. Part of him wanted to cast her out, to return to the simple certainties of his exile. But a larger part, the part that had once stood shield to shield with brave men in the fury of battle, stirred to life for the first time in years. "What do you propose?" he asked. Astrid smiled, and for the first time since awakening, she looked her true age, young enough to be his daughter, yet carrying wisdom that seemed ancient. "We make our stand here. In this place you've made into a fortress without walls. You know this valley better than any man living. You know the trails, the hiding places, the natural choke points where a few can hold against many. And I know things that will give us advantages Magnus cannot anticipate. Such as..." She lifted the bone knife, and the runes along its edge seemed to pulse with their own inner light. "The old magic still works for those who know how to call upon it. The land itself can become our ally if we ask it properly. And the dead," she paused, studying his face, "the dead sometimes have their own reasons for seeking justice." A log shifted in the fire, sending sparks spiraling up toward the smoke hole. Outside, the wind had picked up, moaning through the pines like the voices of restless spirits. Jarnulf felt the weight of 7 years pressing down on him, 7 years of questions without answers, of guilt without certainty, of honor without vindication. When he spoke, his voice carried the iron resolve that had once made him the most feared warrior in Magnus's service. "Then we prepare for war." The discovery came when Astrid was washing herself at the basin while Jarnulf tended the fire. A soft clatter of metal against wood made him turn, and there on the packed earth floor lay a silver arm ring, heavy and intricate, bearing the distinctive knotwork of Jarl Magnus's house. The sight of it hit him like a blow to the chest. "Where did you get that?" His voice came out rougher than he'd intended. Astrid glanced down at the ring, her expression carefully neutral. "It was among my possessions when I fled Magnus's hall. I thought it might prove useful. That belonged to Magnus himself. I watched him wear it at every feast, every ceremony." Jarnulf picked up the ring, feeling its familiar weight. The silver was warm from contact with her skin, and the intricate wolves carved into its surface seemed to snarl at him in the firelight. How does a Volva come to possess a Jarl's personal ornament? The same way she comes to know secrets that powerful men prefer to keep buried. Astrid dried her hands with deliberate care. Sometimes the price of knowledge requires taking risks that others would consider theft. The ring triggered a flood of memories, Magnus placing it on his arm each morning as part of his daily ritual, twisting it when deep in thought, removing it ceremoniously when dispensing judgment. It had been a symbol of authority as much as ornamentation, passed down through 3 generations of Jarls. For it to be here, in this remote valley, spoke to preparations and planning that went far deeper than Astrid had initially revealed. "You've been planning this confrontation for years," Jarnulf said. "It wasn't a question." Since the night I fled the grain stores with my teacher's blood still wet on my hands. Astrid's voice carried old pain, carefully controlled. Magnus's men found her before they found me. She died protecting the knowledge I now carry, and her sacrifice bought me time to escape. Everything since then has been preparation for this moment. Jarnulf set the ring on his work table and studied her face in the firelight. The young woman he'd rescued was revealing depths of calculation and purpose that unsettled him. What else haven't you told me? That Magnus's treachery goes far beyond his brother's murder. The silver he takes from Danish raiders in exchange for safe passage through his waters. The tribute he demands from merchants while claiming it goes to the king's coffers. The way he's been systematically eliminating anyone who might challenge his authority. She gestured toward the ring. That was payment for services rendered to men who should be his enemies. The betrayal cut deeper than Jarnulf had imagined possible. He'd served Magnus for 20 years, believing him to be an honorable lord worthy of loyalty unto death. Every raid they'd undertaken together, every enemy they'd faced, every moment of shared brotherhood in battle, all of it tainted by the revelation of his lord's corruption. The night Bjorn died, Jarnulf said slowly, he'd discovered Magnus's dealings with the Danes. More than discovered. Bjorn had been meeting with representatives from King Harald's court. He intended to expose Magnus's treason at the spring assembly and claim the Jarl ship for himself. Astrid moved to stand beside him, her presence oddly comforting despite the magnitude of what she'd revealed. Magnus killed him to preserve his own position, but he needed a scapegoat to explain the death. You were the perfect choice, loyal enough to take the blame without protest, dangerous enough that people would believe you capable of murder, and I played the part perfectly. Bitter laughter escaped him. Even in exile, I protected his reputation by maintaining my guilt, a loyal dog to the end, a man of honor caught in a web of lies. There's a difference. Astrid placed her hand on his arm, the contact warm and oddly reassuring. Magnus counted on your integrity to sell his deception. He knew you wouldn't proclaim your innocence too loudly, because it would require accusing him directly. Jarnulf stared down at the ring, remembering the weight of it on Magnus's arm as he pronounced the sentence of banishment, how his former lord's eyes had held calculation rather than grief. How quickly the evidence against him had been accepted without deeper investigation. The signs had been there, but loyalty had blinded him to their meaning. How many others know the truth? A few. Bjorn the Tracker suspects something, though he's never voiced his doubts openly. Eric Magnus's son has asked questions his father couldn't answer satisfactorily. Some of the older warriors remember inconsistencies in the official account. But suspicion isn't proof, and Magnus has been careful to eliminate anyone who possessed actual evidence. Until me. She moved to her pack and withdrew a small leather pouch from which she produced several items that made Jarnulf's breath catch. A fragment of cloth bearing Bjorn the Red's blood. A broken piece of Magnus's ceremonial dagger, the one he'd claimed was lost months before his brother's death. And most damning of all, a piece of parchment covered in Magnus's distinctive script, detailing terms of agreement with Danish war leaders. 7 years I've been gathering these pieces, Astrid said quietly. Every scrap of evidence that survived Magnus's attempts to cover his tracks. Every witness who escaped his purges. It's taken this long to assemble proof that even his most loyal supporters couldn't dismiss. Jarnulf handled each item with the reverence due to holy relics. They represented more than evidence, they were his vindication, his path back to honor, the answer to 7 years of questions that had eaten at his soul like acid. Why now? He asked. Why reveal yourself after so long in hiding? Because the Norns have shown me what comes next. Magnus grows bold in his corruption, and his greed will soon outstrip his caution. He plans to betray King Harald himself, to ally openly with the Danish invaders in exchange for recognition as an independent ruler. The spring assembly will be his platform for announcing this treason, disguised as a necessary alliance for the good of his people. The magnitude of Magnus's planned betrayal staggered him. To turn against the king who had granted his family their lands and titles, it was a violation of oath so profound that it would stain his bloodline for generations. He can't believe the other Jarls will support such madness. He doesn't need their support, only their silence. And he's been very effective at ensuring that silence through fear, bribery, or elimination of opposition. Astrid gathered the evidence with careful hands. But if the truth of his past crimes becomes known first, his credibility will crumble. No one follows a kinslayer who blames innocent men for his own sins. Jarnulf stood and walked to the door, stepping outside into the crisp morning air. The valley spread before him, peaceful and beautiful in its isolation, but he could no longer see it as a refuge. It had become a battleground, the place where truth would finally confront lies, where honor would face corruption. When he returned inside, his expression carried the grim determination of a man who had found his purpose after years of aimless exile. 3 days, you said. We'll need every moment to prepare. As evening approached, Astrid drew her raven feather cloak from her pack, a magnificent garment that seemed to ripple with its own dark life. Each feather had been sewn with silver thread that caught the firelight, creating patterns that shifted like living shadows across the black surface. The cloak had belonged to her mentor, she explained, and served as both protection and beacon for those who moved between the world of men and the realm of spirits. The ritual must be performed at the darkest hour, she said, fastening the cloak around her shoulders. When the veil between worlds grows thin and the dead can speak to the living. Tonight, I'll seek guidance from those who watch over this valley. Jarnulf watched her preparation with growing unease. He'd accepted her knowledge of past events, even her claims of prophecy, but this delving into the spirit realm struck him as dangerous territory. What exactly are you planning to summon? Not summon, commune. The land itself holds memory of what has passed upon it, and those who died here sometimes linger to see justice done. She arranged various items around the fire, carved bone pieces, dried herbs that filled the air with sharp scent, and finally, the Volva's knife. I need to understand how many enemies approach and by what route. More importantly, I must know if the spirits of this place will aid us or remain neutral in what's to come. And if they're hostile? Astrid's smile held no warmth. Then we'll face Magnus's warriors without supernatural assistance. But I don't think that will be the case. This valley has been your home for 7 years, and you've treated it with respect. You've taken only what you needed, given back what you could. The old powers recognize such things. She began the ritual as full darkness settled over the land. Her voice rose and fell in rhythms that seemed older than language itself, words in the ancient tongue that made the air itself feel heavy with presence. The fire burned lower and lower until only coals remained, yet the light in the room seemed to intensify, taking on a blue-white quality that made shadows dance like living things. Jarnulf found himself gripping his eating knife without conscious thought, though whether for protection or mere comfort he couldn't say. The temperature in the room had dropped until their breath misted despite the glowing coals, and sounds from outside the wind through the pines, the distant call of night birds, had fallen to absolute silence. Then Astrid gasped, her eyes flying open to reveal pupils so dilated they looked black in the strange light. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that seemed to come from multiple throats. They come with the dawn, following the river path from the east. 23 men in mail and leather, led by one whose heart burns with guilty fire. The tracker knows this place from childhood, hunts he will find your dwelling before the sun reaches its height. Her head tilted as if listening to whispered counsel. But the spirits remember older agreements, older loyalties. They will grant you one boon if you prove worthy of their aid. What kind of boon? Jarnulf asked, though he wasn't entirely sure he wanted to know. The storm that builds in the western mountains, they can turn it toward this valley, hide your movements, and confuse your enemy's approach. But the price is blood freely given and a promise kept. The multiple voices gradually resolved back to Astrid's normal tone. You must swear by your father's name, and your father's father's name, that justice will be served by your hand, that the innocent will be protected, and the guilty punished according to their crimes. The weight of generations pressed down on him. His father Grim had been a man of uncompromising honor, as had Grim's father Ulf before him. Both had died in service to oaths sworn in good faith. To invoke their names was to bind himself not just to action, but to the moral certainty that had guided his bloodline for generations. I swear it, he said, and felt something shift in the air around them. By Grim Ironarm's name and Ulf the Steadfast's name, justice will be served. Astrid nodded and drew the Volva's knife across her palm, letting drops of blood fall onto the coals. They hissed and sparked, sending up smoke that formed shapes almost too quick to follow ravens, wolves, and other forms that might have been men with spears. Then the strange light faded. Normal temperature returned, and the sounds of the night resumed as if nothing had happened. It's done, she said, binding her cut hand with strips of cloth. The storm will come with tomorrow's dawn, giving us cover for what must be done. But there's something else. A warning the spirits felt compelled to share. What warning? Magnus doesn't come merely to silence me. He's learned that Eric, his own son, has been asking questions about the night Bjorn died. The boy has been corresponding with King Harald's representatives, sharing his suspicions about his father's version of events. Astrid's expression grew troubled. Magnus intends to eliminate both threats at once. He'll claim that Eric was corrupted by association with me, that his son fell under a Volva's spell and must be put down for the good of the clan. The revelation hit Jarnulf like a physical blow. Eric had been barely 12 summers when his uncle died, a bright boy who'd followed Jarnulf around like a devoted puppy. The thought of Magnus planning his own son's death for the crime of seeking truth, it spoke to corruption so complete that no redemption remained possible. We have to warn him. Eric rides with his father's war band, Astrid said quietly. Magnus keeps him close now, claiming it's to complete his warrior training. In reality, it ensures the boy can't act on his suspicions or escape his father's reach when the time comes. Then we save them both, Eric from his father's treachery, and ourselves from Magnus's hunters. Jarnulf stood and began checking his weapons with the methodical care of a man preparing for battle. How long since you've been in a real fight? Long enough to forget the taste of fear, not long enough to forget how to kill when necessary. Astrid tested the edge of her bone knife against a piece of leather. The spirits showed me something else. Bjorn the Tracker isn't entirely loyal to Magnus anymore. He's begun to suspect the truth about that night 7 years ago. If we can reach him before the killing starts. A man who changes sides mid-battle is a man who can't be trusted by either side. Perhaps he's simply a man who's finally ready to serve honor instead of expediency. She wrapped the raven cloak more tightly around her shoulders. We'll know soon enough. The storm comes with dawn, and our enemies come with it. The storm arrived with dawn as promised, rolling down from the western peaks like an avalanche of grey cloud and wind-driven snow. Jarnulf watched it approach from the doorway of his homestead, marveling at how the weather seemed to move with purpose rather than the random patterns of nature. The spirits had kept their bargain, now it remained to be seen if mortal men could keep theirs. Through the swirling snow, he could make out movement on the eastern ridge, where the old deer trail descended toward the valley floor. Dark shapes that moved too purposefully to be wildlife, too numerous to be hunters. Magnus had come as Astrid foretold, bringing war to this place that had known only peace for 7 years. There, Astrid said, joining him at the threshold. She pointed toward a banner barely visible through the storm, a crimson cloth bearing the blood eagle, Magnus's battle standard. 23 men, as the spirit said, But look how they move uncertainty in their formation. The storm blinds them as surely as it conceals us. Jarnulf studied the approaching warband with the eye of a man who'd planned and fought countless battles. They were moving in single file down the treacherous path, each man focused on the footing rather than the terrain ahead. Good warriors all, no doubt, but fighting in unfamiliar ground under adverse conditions. The advantage was his, if he could exploit it properly. Bjorn leads the advance scouts, he observed, recognizing the tracker's distinctive gait, even at distance. 3 men with him, probably his best hunters. Magnus holds the main body back smart, but it divides his force. And Eric? Jarnulf scanned the distant figures until he spotted a younger man riding close beside Magnus's unmistakable bulk. Even through the storm, he could see the boy's reluctance in his posture, the way he seemed to argue with his father before being silenced with sharp gestures. Still alive, still questioning. Magnus hasn't acted yet, but the moment will come. He stepped back inside and began donning his war gear, the leather byrnie he'd crafted himself, the iron cap that had deflected more blows than he could count, the seeks and hand axe that had served him through decades of combat. We need to separate them before Magnus decides his son has become too great a liability. Astrid nodded and gathered her own preparations. The raven cloak went over her shoulders, followed by additional layers of wool and hide that would protect against both weather and weapons. She secured the Volva's knife at her belt and added several small pouches containing what she called necessary provisions, herbs, powders, and other items whose purpose Jarnulf preferred not to examine too closely. The spirits whispered of a place, she said, as they readied themselves. A narrow defile where the stream cuts through the rock outcropping, perhaps half a mile north of here. If we can draw some of them into that space, they'll be trapped like sheep in a slaughter pen. Jarnulf smiled grimly. I know the place barely wide enough for 2 men abreast, with walls too steep to climb. But how do we separate them without revealing ourselves too early? Leave that to me. The storm isn't the only advantage the spirits have granted us. She touched one of the pouches at her belt. I can create distractions that will seem like natural phenomena, rock slides triggered by wind, paths that appear clear but lead into dead ends, sounds that draw men away from their intended route. Magnus's warriors will find this valley far more treacherous than they expected. They slipped out into the storm, moving through terrain Jarnulf knew like the lines of his own palms. The snow fell so thickly it created a white wall barely 10 paces in any direction, but he navigated by landmarks invisible to others, the shape of stones, the bend of particular trees, the way sound echoed off unseen cliffs. Behind him, Astrid moved with surprising grace for one unaccustomed to such conditions, her footing sure despite the treacherous ground. The first of Bjorn's scouts appeared through the snow like a ghost materializing from the spirit realm. He was young, perhaps 20 summers, with the lean build of a man who made his living moving silently through wild places. His eyes swept the terrain professionally, but they were looking for signs of human habitation, not for enemies already in position. Jarnulf let him pass, then followed at a distance that kept the scout just visible through the storm. The young man was competent but not exceptional, missing several opportunities to spot the tracks he and Astrid had deliberately left. More importantly, he was moving exactly as predicted, following the most obvious path toward the homestead rather than scouting for alternate routes or potential ambush sites. A soft whistle from behind told him Astrid had reached her position. She crouched among the rocks, overlooking the main trail, her dark cloak making her nearly invisible against the snow-covered stone. When she raised her hand, Jarnulf saw her lips moving in what might have been prayer or incantation. Then the wind shifted with unnatural suddenness, and a section of loose scree broke free from the slope above the trail. The landslide wasn't large, just enough to block the path and force the advancing warriors to seek an alternate route. but it served its purpose perfectly, separating the advanced scouts from the main body and channeling them toward the defile, where Jarnulf waited. More importantly, it appeared completely natural, a consequence of storm and unstable ground rather than enemy action. Bjorn himself appeared at the head of the alternate path, his weathered face grim with concentration as he read the signs left by his scattered men. This was the moment of greatest danger. If the veteran tracker recognized the signs of deliberate misdirection, he would alert Magnus, and the advantage would be lost. But Bjorn saw only what the storm allowed him to see, and Astrid's subtle manipulations had created a trail of evidence that led inexorably toward the trap. One scout's footprints heading north toward the defile, broken branches suggesting a man moving quickly through difficult terrain. Even a scrap of fabric caught on a thorn bush, as if someone had passed in haste. "Clever," Bjorn muttered to himself, loud enough for Jarnulf to hear from his concealed position, but not clever enough. The veteran tracker signaled to his remaining men and began following the false trail, his confidence growing with each piece of apparent evidence. Behind him, the storm continued to work its concealment, hiding the true nature of what awaited them in the narrow stone passage ahead. Jarnulf smiled coldly and began moving into position for the killing that would follow. The defile proved to be everything Jarnulf had hoped, a natural killing ground where 4 men could hold against 20. Steep walls rose on either side, carved by countless years of spring, floods into smooth stone that offered no handholds for climbing. The passage narrowed at its center to barely 6 feet across, forcing any attackers to approach in single file through knee-deep snow that would slow their advance to a crawl. Astrid had positioned herself at the far end, where a tumble of boulders provided both concealment and an escape route, should the trap fail. Her raven cloak blended perfectly with the storm-darkened stone, and she'd arranged several of her mysterious pouches within easy reach. Whatever Sidra she planned to work, the stage was set for its performance. Jarnulf crouched behind an outcropping near the entrance, close enough to see Bjorn approaching through the swirling snow. The veteran tracker moved with professional caution now, his weathered face alert for signs of danger. But the storm that concealed the ambush also muffled sound and scent, leaving him dependent on sight alone in conditions that reduced visibility to mere paces. The first scout entered the defile without hesitation, following what appeared to be fresh tracks in the snow. Behind him came a second warrior, then Bjorn himself, and finally the 4th member of their group, young Eric, pressed into service despite his obvious reluctance. Jarnulf's breath caught as he recognized Magnus's son. The boy had grown in the 7 years since their last meeting, filling out into the broad shoulders and strong limbs that marked his bloodline. But his face still held the honest openness that had made him so easy to love as a child, unmarked by the cynical calculation that characterized his father. Eric was questioning something. Jarnulf could see his lips moving as he gestured toward the tracks they followed. Bjorn's response was sharp enough to silence the younger man, but not before Jarnulf caught a glimpse of the truth-seeker the boy had become. Whatever doubts Eric harbored about his father's version of events, they ran deep enough to risk voicing even here. The moment had come. 4 men in the trap, the main warband still struggling through the storm some distance behind. Jarnulf drew his sea axe with one hand and his throwing axe with the other, then stepped into view at the defile's mouth. "Hello, Bjorn," he said quietly. "It's been a long time." The tracker spun toward him, hand already reaching for his sword, but froze when he recognized the voice. Behind him, the 2 scouts reacted with the speed of trained warriors, weapons appearing in their hands with practiced ease. Only Eric remained motionless, his face cycling through shock, recognition, and something that might have been relief. "Jarnulf Ironarm," Bjorn said slowly. "So you didn't flee to distant lands after all. This valley has been my home for 7 years. Long enough to learn its secrets, long enough to know when uninvited guests arrive." He kept his weapons ready, but not obviously threatening. "Question is, Bjorn, are you here to arrest a kinslayer or to murder an innocent man? My orders are clear. Magnus wants the Volva who escaped his custody, and any who might shelter her. But there was uncertainty in the tracker's voice, doubt that hadn't been there moments before. And what does Magnus want with this Volva? What threat could one young woman pose to a Jarl's authority? Bjorn's weathered features tightened. That's not for me to question, isn't it? Jarnulf shifted position slightly, angling himself to watch all four men without giving ground. You were there the night Bjorn the Red died. You saw the scene, examined the evidence. Did it seem right to you, the way everything fit together so neatly? I saw what I saw. You saw what Magnus wanted you to see, just as you're seeing what he wants you to see now. From the far end of the defile came the sound Astrid had promised, a low humming that seemed to rise from the stone itself. But some truths can't be buried forever. The humming grew louder, taking on harmonics that made the air itself seem to vibrate. Astrid's voice joined it, chanting in the old tongue, and suddenly the smooth walls of the defile were no longer empty. Shapes moved within the stone, ghostly figures that might have been trick of light and shadow, or might have been something more substantial. The spirits of those who had died unavenged, drawn by the promise of justice, finally served. One of the scouts backed away from the walls, his face pale with terror. "Cedar," he whispered. "Dark magic." "Not dark," came Astrid's voice from among the boulders, though she remained hidden from sight. "Ancient. The land itself remembers what passed upon it, and the dead remember who wronged them." A new voice joined hers, older, speaking with authority that seemed to come from the stone itself. "Tell them, Bjorn Tracker. Tell them what you saw but couldn't speak." The shapes in the walls grew clearer, taking on human form. Warriors from bygone eras, Volvas and wise women, kings and thralls, all those who had died with truth unspoken and justice unserved. And among them, becoming clearer with each passing moment, the figure of Bjorn the Red himself. "By Thor's hammer," Eric breathed, staring at his uncle's ghostly form. "Uncle Bjorn." The spectral figure turned toward his nephew, and when it spoke, the voice carried the weight of 7 years' silence. "The boy seeks truth, but his father feeds him lies. The giant bears no guilt for my death, that burden rests with blood of my blood." Bjorn the Tracker stumbled backward, his sword falling from nerveless fingers. "This cannot be. The dead don't walk among us. The dead walk when the living fail in their duty to honor truth." The spirit's attention fixed on the veteran warrior. "You knew, Tracker. You saw the inconsistencies, noticed the convenient evidence, felt the wrongness of it all. But fear kept you silent, while an innocent man suffered exile. I had no proof. You had eyes to see, and a mind to think. That should have been enough." The ghostly figure raised one translucent hand. "But redemption remains possible, even for those who failed in their first duty. The choice comes again: serve lies or serve truth. Choose wisely, for this chance will not come a third time." The supernatural display faded as suddenly as it had begun, leaving 4 shaken men standing in natural stone passage once more. But the truth that had been spoken hung in the air between them like a blade awaiting its target. Eric found his voice first. "Is it true? Did my father kill Uncle Bjorn?" Jarnulf lowered his weapons, seeing the change that had come over them all. "Ask the man who investigated the scene. Ask him what he really saw that night." Bjorn the Tracker stood silent for long moments, his weathered face working through emotions that had been buried for 7 years. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of confession. The blood patterns were wrong. When a man kills in rage, the spray follows the arc of the weapon. But Bjorn the Red's blood, it fell as if he'd been struck from behind, then repositioned to face his attacker. "Why didn't you speak?" Eric demanded, his young face flushed with anger and betrayal. "Because questioning a Jarl's word is treason, and treason means death for me and mine." Bjorn's shoulders sagged under the burden of his silence. I have a wife, grandchildren. Magnus made it clear what would happen to anyone who spread doubt about his version of events. Astrid emerged from her concealment among the boulders, moving with purpose toward the group. As she approached, she reached within her cloak and withdrew an object that made Jarnulf's blood run cold, a pendant bearing a shard of what looked like crystalline metal, dark as storm clouds but shot through with veins of silver light. "There's more you need to understand," she said, her voice carrying new urgency. "The corruption that has taken Magnus runs deeper than mere greed or ambition. This pendant bears a fragment of Odin's own spear, Gungnir, and it has shown me truths that mortal eyes cannot see." She held the pendant aloft, and the stormlight seemed to gather around the crystal shard. The air grew thick with presence, as if the All-Father himself drew near to witness what would be revealed. "I am the last of an ancient bloodline," Astrid continued, "chosen by the gods themselves to serve as witness and judgment when mortal authority fails. The pendant was given to my mother by a one-eyed wanderer who spoke of a time when honor would war against corruption, when the old ways would clash with powers that seek to unmake the world." The crystal pulsed with inner light, and suddenly the truth blazed forth with clarity that brooked no denial. Images filled the air around them, not ghostly shapes this time, but visions as real as memory. They saw Magnus 7 years ago, but not the man they'd known. His eyes held a hunger that went beyond human ambition, and when he moved, shadows followed him like living things. "He made a bargain," Astrid said, her voice thick with revulsion. "On the night he killed his brother, Magnus called upon powers that dwelt in darkness before the world was shaped. They granted him strength, cunning, and the ability to twist men's minds to his will in exchange." The vision shifted, showing Magnus in his private chambers, speaking words in a language that hurt to hear. Dark shapes clustered around him, whispering counsel that no mortal man should heed. And at the center of it all, a presence that radiated malevolence so pure it made the watchers step back involuntarily. "He promised to prepare the way for their return," Astrid finished. "To corrupt the bonds that hold clans together, to turn warrior against warrior until the land runs red with civil war. When enough blood has been spilled, when enough oaths have been broken, the barriers between worlds will weaken enough for the ancient enemies to walk among men once more." Eric stared at the visions with the expression of a man watching his world crumble. "My father, he's not even human anymore." "He chose his path," Jarnulf said grimly, "but that doesn't make him any less dangerous. These powers he's allied with, they've been working through him for years, haven't they?" Astrid nodded. "Every warrior who died in raids that served no purpose but bloodshed, every merchant killed for tribute that went into Magnus's coffers instead of the king's, every rival who mysteriously sickened and died after opposing his will, all of it feeding the darkness he serves." The crystal's light revealed one final image: Magnus as he was now, riding through the storm toward them. But the man in the vision bore only superficial resemblance to the Jarl they'd once known. His eyes burned with unnatural fire, and the very air around him seemed to writhe with malevolent presence. "He knows we're here," Astrid said, lowering the pendant. "The entities that guide him can sense the divine fragment just as it reveals their influence. He's driving his men forward through the storm because he knows this is his last chance to silence the truth." "Then we fight," Bjorn said, his voice steady now that the full scope of the threat was clear. "Whatever bargains he's made, whatever powers he commands, he's still flesh and blood." "Is he?" one of the scouts asked, his face pale with terror. "If he's been touched by such darkness—" "He bleeds," Jarnulf said with grim certainty. "I've seen him cut himself shaving, seen him nursing injuries from sparring matches. Whatever bargains he's made haven't changed his mortality." "But the pendant? What exactly does it do?" "It carries a fragment of divine will, a piece of the spear that never misses its mark. In the right hands, wielded with pure intent, it can pierce any deception, break any enchantment. She looked directly at him. But the prophecy was clear, it must be the giant who makes the choice. When mercy and might diverge, when the old order faces the new, the one who chose compassion over conquest must strike the blow that fells the corruption. The weight of destiny settled on Jarnulf's shoulders like a mantle of lead. 7 years of exile, 7 years of questioning his purpose, and it had all led to this moment. He was to be the instrument of divine justice, the weapon wielded by gods against powers that sought to unmake the world. "What about Magnus's other men?" Eric asked. "They're not all corrupted. Some of them are good warriors following orders they believe to be legitimate." "That's why we're here," Bjorn said, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Not just to stop Magnus, but to give them a chance to choose their own path when the truth is revealed." "Some will stand with him regardless," Astrid warned. "The corruption spreads through proximity and shared violence. Those who've spilled innocent blood at his command, who've participated willingly in his darkest acts, they're bound to him now in ways that go beyond mere loyalty." A sound echoed through the storm war horns calling across the valley, Magnus rallying his scattered forces for the final assault. The time for revelation had passed. Now came the test of whether mortal courage could stand against supernatural malice, whether truth could triumph over lies backed by powers older than memory. Jarnulf checked his weapons one final time and looked at his unlikely allies, a tracker haunted by years of cowardice, a young man facing the truth about his father's corruption, 2 scouts whose world had just been turned upside down, and a Volva bearing the weight of divine purpose. "Then let's go remind Magnus that some truths can't be buried," he said, "and some choices can't be undone." The crystal shard pulsed once more in response, as if the All-Father himself had given his blessing to what was to come. The war horns sounded again, closer now, and with them came something that made the storm itself seem to recoil. Magnus had brought more than warriors to this final confrontation. He'd brought artifacts of binding, tools forged in darkness to contain powers that threatened his corrupt rule. Through the swirling snow, Jarnulf caught glimpses of iron chains, black as midnight, and inscribed with runes that hurt to look upon directly. "The iron collar of binding," Astrid breathed, her face pale with recognition. "I thought it was legend, a device crafted in the time before memory to imprison supernatural beings. If Magnus has truly obtained such a thing, then he means to chain you like a beast," Eric finished, his young voice hard with disgust. "My father has fallen further than I imagined possible." Bjorn spat into the snow. "Those chains were forged for binding trolls and giants in the old stories. What does he think to accomplish by using them against a Volva?" "He knows what I carry," Astrid replied, touching the pendant at her throat. "The divine fragment makes me dangerous to his masters. If he can bind my power, prevent me from wielding Odin's blessing, then the truth dies with me, and his corruption remains secure." The sound of approaching warriors grew steadily louder, the crunch of boots through snow, the clink of mail and weapons, the harsh breathing of men pushing themselves through the storm. Magnus was driving them hard, desperate to reach his quarry before the weather could provide any more advantages to the defenders. Jarnulf studied the terrain around them with tactical eyes, mapping positions and possibilities. The defile had served its purpose for the initial confrontation, but it would become a trap if they remained here against superior numbers. Better to fall back to ground of his choosing, where the advantages of local knowledge could be fully exploited. "We move to the homestead," he decided. "The building can't hold against 20 men, but the approaches can be defended. More importantly, it's ground I know every stone of." "What about the chains?" one of the scouts asked. "If Magnus has truly brought binding magic, then we ensure he doesn't get the chance to use it," Jarnulf said grimly. "Astrid, how much warning will you have if he tries to work the binding ritual? The iron will sing when activated, and the air itself will grow heavy with malevolent purpose. But once the ritual begins, I'll have only moments before the chains seek their target." She gathered her raven cloak more tightly around her shoulders. "There may be another way. If I can reach the pendant's full power before Magnus strikes, I might be able to turn his own binding against him. That sounds dangerously like gambling with forces none of us understand, Bjorn observed. All of this is gambling with forces beyond mortal comprehension, Eric replied. The question is whether we trust in divine justice or surrender to supernatural corruption. They began moving through the storm, following paths that Jarnulf had worn through 7 years of solitary existence. Behind them, Magnus's warband spread out in a hunting formation, their shouts echoing off the valley walls as they sought to corner their prey. But the storm that had been called by spiritual agreement still provided concealment, and Jarnulf's intimate knowledge of the terrain let him choose routes that would confuse pursuers. As they climbed toward the homestead, Astrid began preparing for what was to come. She arranged items from her various pouches in specific patterns, muttering incantations under her breath that made the air around her shimmer with barely contained power. The pendant at her throat pulsed in rhythm with her chanting, and gradually the storm light began to gather around her like a personal aurora. The ritual must be completed at the moment of greatest need, she explained as they took position among the rocks above Jarnulf's dwelling. If I attempt it too early, Magnus will have time to counter with his own workings. Too late, and the binding chains will prevent me from accessing the divine fragment's full power. Eric crouched beside a boulder that would provide cover from arrows, his young face set with determination that reminded Jarnulf painfully of the boy he'd once known. "What do you need from us?" "Time," Astrid replied simply, "and when the moment comes, absolute faith that justice will prevail. The pendant draws its power from righteousness, doubt or despair will weaken its effectiveness when we can least afford such failure." The first of Magnus's warriors appeared through the storm, moving cautiously now that they approached their target. These were seasoned veterans, men who'd fought beside Jarnulf in campaigns across the northern seas. He recognized faces, remembered names, felt the bitter irony of preparing to kill men he'd once called shield brothers. "There, Gunnar the Bold and Thorvald Scararm," he murmured to Bjorn. "Good men, but they've been with Magnus too long to question orders now. And there's Olaf Grudgebearer," Bjorn added, pointing to a massive warrior whose axe had drunk deeply of enemy blood. "He's been touched by the same darkness as his master. Look at his eyes." Indeed, several of the approaching warriors showed signs of supernatural corruption. Their movements held an unnatural fluidity, and their eyes reflected light like those of nocturnal predators. These men were no longer entirely human, bound to Magnus by more than mere loyalty. Then Magnus himself stepped into view, and the temperature seemed to drop another 10 degrees. The Jarl, who had once been Jarnulf's beloved lord, was gone, replaced by something that wore his face like a mask. Shadows writhed around him despite the bright stormlight, and when he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that belonged to no mortal throat. "Jarnulf Ironarm," he called across the distance between them. 7 years you've hidden in this wilderness, nursing grievances against justice fairly served, but your exile ends today, along with the lies spread by the witch who corrupts your mind. The only corruption here is what you've brought with you," Jarnulf replied, stepping into clear view. "I know what you did to your brother, Magnus. I know what bargains you've made, what prices you've paid. The question is whether there's enough of the man I once served left to feel shame for it." Magnus laughed, and the sound made frost form on nearby stones despite the lack of visible breath. "Shame? I feel only satisfaction at having removed obstacles to necessary change." Bjorn was weak, clinging to old ways that no longer serve. You were strong but honorable, which made you equally useless. The new age requires different virtues, such as murdering one's own blood and blaming innocent men for it, such as doing what must be done regardless of sentiment. Magnus gestured, and the warriors bearing the iron chains stepped forward. The metal sang as they moved, a sound like wind through a graveyard that made every living thing in the valley recoil instinctively. But enough words. You've harbored my enemy long enough. Surrender the witch, and I might allow you to live out your days in proper captivity rather than death. Counter-proposal, Jarnulf said, drawing his weapons. Surrender yourself to justice, and I might allow some of your men to survive what comes next. The iron chains began to glow with cold fire, and Astrid's pendant responded with warmth that seemed to draw light from the storm itself. The final confrontation had begun, not just between mortal enemies, but between cosmic forces that had waited years for this moment of resolution. So be it, Magnus said, and raised his hand to signal the attack. Kill them all, but bring me the vulva alive. Her blood will seal the bargain that makes me more than merely human. The war cries that answered him held notes that no human throat should have been able to produce, and the battle that followed would determine not just the fate of a remote valley, but the balance between light and darkness in all the 9 realms. Magnus raised his hand toward the storm clouds, and the weather itself seemed to bend to his corrupt will. What had been natural snowfall became something far more sinister, a crystalline artifact materialized in his grasp, pulsing with unnatural cold that made the very air around it freeze into razor-sharp fragments. The heart of winter, a relic of power that should never have been wielded by mortal hands. Let the valley learn what true cold means, Magnus intoned, and the temperature plummeted so suddenly that breath turned to ice crystals in the lungs. The storm transformed into a weapon, wind-driven snow becoming as cutting as steel, visibility dropping to mere arm's length. Jarnulf felt the supernatural winter bite into his bones, but he'd survived 7 natural winters in this valley and knew how to endure. Around him, his allies pressed close together for warmth, while Magnus's warriors advanced through conditions that should have been impossible for any living thing to navigate. The first clash came without warning Gunnar the Bold, materializing from the storm with his sword already swinging. Jarnulf met the attack with his sea-axe, the familiar weight of combat flooding back through muscles that had been too long at peace. But Gunnar moved with unnatural speed now, his strength enhanced by whatever darkness had claimed him. Steel rang against steel in the howling wind as the 2 veterans fought with deadly skill honed through decades of war. Gunnar pressed his advantage ruthlessly, driving Jarnulf back toward the rocky outcropping where the others waited. But the exile had learned patience during his years of solitude, and he gave ground deliberately, drawing his opponent into position for the killing stroke. When it came, it was Eric who struck the blow, the young man's spear taking Gunnar between the shoulder blades as he committed to a final attack. The corrupted warrior fell with a sound that was part human scream, part something else entirely, his blood steaming in the supernatural cold. Well struck, Jarnulf called to Eric, but the boy's face had gone pale with the reality of killing a man he'd known since childhood. Focus on survival, Bjorn shouted from where he grappled with Thorvald's scar arm. Mourn the dead later, if we live to do so. The veteran tracker had found his courage at last, fighting with the skill that had made him Magnus's most valued hunter. His opponent was stronger, but Bjorn knew every trick of dirty fighting that kept men alive in desperate situations. When Thorvald overextended in a powerful thrust, Bjorn slipped inside his guard and opened his throat with a hunting knife. More warriors emerged from the storm, their movements coordinated in ways that spoke of supernatural guidance. The 2 scouts who'd chosen to stand with them fought bravely, but were quickly overwhelmed, falling beneath multiple attackers whose eyes burned with inhuman fire. Astrid stood at the center of their formation, the divine pendant blazing with light that pushed back against Magnus's artificial winter. But she was fighting a battle on multiple fronts, maintaining the spiritual defenses that kept them from being completely overwhelmed while preparing the greater working that would be needed to stop Magnus himself. The binding chains, she called urgently. They're beginning the ritual. Through the storm, Jarnulf could see Magnus directing his remaining warriors in a complex pattern of movement, their iron chains forming geometric shapes in the snow. The metal sang with increasing intensity, and the air grew thick with malevolent purpose as supernatural forces gathered for the binding that would neutralize Astrid's power. "We have to break their formation," Jarnulf decided, hefting his throwing axe. The range was long for such a cast, visibility was nearly non-existent, and failure would mean the loss of one of his few remaining weapons. But if the binding ritual completed, nothing else would matter. He drew back his arm and let the axe fly, guided more by instinct than sight through the swirling snow. The weapon disappeared into the storm, and for a moment there was only the howling wind and the singing of iron chains. Then came a scream of pain and rage, not entirely human, as the axe found its mark. One of the chain-bearers stumbled and fell, disrupting the careful pattern Magnus required for the binding. The ritual faltered, its supernatural momentum broken just as it approached completion. "Now!" Astrid cried, raising the pendant high. Divine light exploded outward from the crystal fragment, pushing back the artificial winter and revealing the true scope of the battle raging around them. Bodies lay scattered in the snow, corrupted warriors and defenders alike, fallen to supernatural cold and mortal steel. Magnus stood at the center of his broken ritual circle, rage twisting his features into something barely recognizable as human. The heart of winter pulsed in his grasp, gathering power for another attack. But the advantage had shifted. With the binding ritual disrupted and the storm's concealment stripped away, the final confrontation would be fought on equal terms, mortal will against supernatural corruption, with the fate of the valley hanging in the balance. In the moment when divine light banished the artificial winter, Astrid pressed a simple eating knife into Jarnulf's hands. The blade had been blessed with her blood and tears, transformed from humble tool into something far greater, the mercy blade, a weapon that could harm spirits and cut through deceptions that had endured for years. "Remember," she said urgently, as Magnus gathered himself for a final assault, "this ends not with vengeance but with justice. The blade will only work if wielded with pure intent." Magnus raised the heart of winter above his head, and the unnatural cold began building again. But this time, Jarnulf was ready. The eating knife felt strange in his grip, lighter than his war weapons, but somehow more significant, as if it carried the weight of every choice that had led to this moment. "You cost me 7 years, Magnus snarled, his voice carrying harmonics from the dark powers that possessed him. 7 years of having to explain why my most trusted weapon turned traitor. But it ends here, in this forgotten place where no one will witness your final failure." "Witnesses matter less than truth," Jarnulf replied, advancing through snow that crunched beneath his boots. Around them, the surviving warriors, both corrupted and loyal, had pulled back to form a rough circle, as if recognizing that this confrontation transcended mortal combat. Magnus struck first, the heart of winter sending a lance of killing cold that should have frozen Jarnulf's blood in his veins. But the blessed blade turned aside the supernatural attack, its simple steel proof against powers that had terrorized the ancient world. They closed with each other like the old enemies they had become, Magnus wielding artifacts of darkness, while Jarnulf carried only a knife blessed by righteousness. The Jarl's strength was inhuman now, his speed enhanced by bargains with entities that fed on corruption. But 7 years of surviving alone had taught Jarnulf patience, and the mercy he had shown to a dying woman had purified his purpose in ways that no amount of supernatural power could overcome. "You were my most loyal follower," Magnus gasped as they grappled in the snow. "Why couldn't you simply accept the justice of my judgment?" "Because innocent men don't accept guilt for crimes they didn't commit," Jarnulf replied, working the blessed blade closer to his target, "and because some loyalties run deeper than service to mortal lords." The heart of winter pulsed between them, its cold burning against Jarnulf's skin even through his heavy clothing. But the eating knife began to glow with warmth that had nothing to do with forge fire, responding to the righteousness of its purpose. When the blade finally found its mark, sliding between Magnus's ribs to pierce the heart that had been corrupted by supernatural bargains, the effect was immediate and devastating. Magnus screamed, not with human pain, but with the agony of entities being torn from their mortal anchor. Dark shapes writhed around his falling body, shadows given substance that clawed at reality itself before being pulled back into whatever realm had spawned them. The heart of winter shattered like ice in spring sun, its unnatural cold dissipating as natural weather reclaimed the valley. "Father," Eric breathed, kneeling beside the body of the man who had raised and betrayed him. Magnus looked smaller in death, his features peaceful for the first time in years. Whatever corruption had claimed him was gone now, leaving only the memory of the honorable Jarl he had once been. Bjorn the Tracker stood over them both, his weathered face reflecting the complexity of emotions that came with witnessing justice finally served. "It's done," he said simply. "The truth can be told now without fear of retribution." Around the circle, the surviving warriors who had served Magnus in good faith began to understand what they had witnessed. The supernatural elements were beyond their full comprehension, but the human tragedy was clear enough. A good man corrupted by power, brought down by the very loyalty he had betrayed. "What happens now?" one of them asked, his voice uncertain in the aftermath of revelation. "Now we return to Magnus's hall and speak the truth," Eric said, rising from his father's side with new resolve. "Every man here will witness before the assembled clans that Jarnulf Ironarm bears no guilt for my uncle's death, that my father's crimes have been answered with justice rather than vengeance." Astrid retrieved the eating knife from Jarnulf's hands, its blessed nature fading now that its purpose had been fulfilled. "The pendant showed me one final vision," she said quietly. "Your exile is ended, but your true work begins now. The valley has need of a guardian, and the clans will have need of a man who chose mercy over might when the moment of testing came." Jarnulf looked around at the peaceful aftermath of supernatural battle, at the snow beginning to fall naturally once more, at the faces of men who had rediscovered honor in the crucible of truth. 7 years of exile had prepared him for this moment, and 7 more years would not be enough to undo all the damage that corruption had wrought. But it was a beginning, and sometimes beginnings were enough. Spring came early to the Nordheim valley that year, as if the land itself celebrated the lifting of corruption that had poisoned it for too long. The snow melted with unusual swiftness, revealing green shoots that pushed through the earth weeks ahead of their natural time. Jarnulf stood in the doorway of his rebuilt homestead, watching steam rise from the warming ground while he contemplated how thoroughly his world had changed. 3 months had passed since the confrontation that ended Magnus's reign and restored truth to its proper place. The spring assembly at Ironhold had been unlike any in living memory, a gathering where supernatural events were recounted alongside political testimony, where the boundaries between legend and reality blurred in the telling of recent events. Bjorn the Tracker had spoken first, his weathered voice carrying across the assembled jarls and their retainers as he confessed his years of silence and detailed the evidence he had observed but failed to report. His testimony alone might have been dismissed as the ramblings of a guilty conscience, but it was followed by Eric's account of his father's final transformation and the supernatural battle that preceded his death. Most compelling of all had been Astrid's presentation of the physical evidence, the blood-stained cloth, the broken dagger fragment, the parchment bearing Magnus's treasonous agreements with Danish raiders. When combined with the testimony of the warriors who had witnessed the final confrontation, even the most skeptical observers were forced to acknowledge that justice had been served, however unusual its form. King Harold himself had attended the assembly's final day, drawn by reports of treachery within his realm and supernatural intervention in mortal affairs. The king was a practical man who cared more for results than methods, and the results spoke clearly enough. A corrupt Jarl had been removed, his crimes exposed, and his son had proven worthy of inheriting legitimate authority. Let it be recorded, Harold had declared before the assembled witnesses, that Jarnulf Ironarm bears no stain upon his honour. His exile is ended, his reputation restored, and his service to justice acknowledged by crown and clan alike. But the formal vindication, welcome as it was, had brought with it choices that Jarnulf found more difficult than the battles preceding them. Eric had offered him lands and title, a place of honour in the reformed household that would replace his father's corrupt rule. Other Jarls had made similar overtures, eager to associate themselves with a man whose story was already being shaped into legend by travelling skalds. All of these offers Jarnulf had politely declined. 7 years of exile had taught him to value different things than wealth and status. The valley had become more than refuge, it had become home in a way that no hall or holding could match. Instead, he had accepted a different role, one that suited both his temperament and his experience. The king had appointed him guardian of the northern reaches, responsible for monitoring the remote valleys and mountain passes where supernatural threats might emerge. It was work that required a man who could recognize dangers that existed beyond the scope of normal military thinking, and recent events had proven Jarnulf's qualifications beyond question. Astrid had remained in the valley as well, establishing what she called a school of true sight, a place where young people showing signs of spiritual sensitivity could learn to use their gifts responsibly. The vulva traditions had been dying out for generations, but the recent crisis had demonstrated their continued relevance in a world where old powers still stirred beneath the surface of everyday life. Her first student had arrived the previous week, a girl of perhaps 15 summers, whose prophetic dreams had begun troubling her sleep. Under Astrid's patient guidance, the child was learning to interpret visions without being overwhelmed by them, to serve as bridge between the mortal world and the realms beyond mortal sight. She has potential, Astrid had told him the night before. In time, she may become as skilled as any vulva of the old bloodlines, but that depends on whether she chooses wisdom or power when the testing comes. The distinction had become important to both of them. Power could be taken or granted, but wisdom had to be earned through experience and reflection. The valley was becoming a place where such earning could happen safely, away from the corrupted influences that had claimed too many promising lives. A new banner hung above Jarnulf's rebuilt door, not the elaborate heraldry of jarls and kings, but a simple cloth bearing his personal symbol combined with Astrid's runes. It represented partnership rather than dominance, the marriage of strength and wisdom that would guide their shared work in the years to come. Eric visited regularly, his young leadership proving more effective than his father's tyranny had ever been. The boy had learned from witnessing corruption firsthand, and his rule emphasized justice over expediency, honor over profit. Under his guidance, Magnus's former domain was healing from years of spiritual poison, returning to the values that had once made it prosperous and respected. "You saved more than my life that day," Eric had told him during his most recent visit. "You saved my soul from following the same dark path my father chose. That debt can never be fully repaid." "No debt exists between us," Jarnulf had replied. "You chose your own path when the moment came. Honor the choice by continuing to choose wisely." Now, watching the early flowers bloom where snow had so recently fallen, Jarnulf reflected on the strange turns that fate could take. 7 years ago, he had been a weapon in service to corruption, his strength used to enforce the will of a man who had betrayed every oath of loyalty and kinship. Today, he was a guardian of truth, his experience used to protect those who could not protect themselves. The choice that had defined everything, the decision to show mercy to a dying stranger, seemed smaller in memory than it had felt at the time. But small choices, he had learned, could reshape entire worlds when made with pure intent. Somewhere in the distance, ravens called to each other across the warming valley, their voices carrying news between the world of mortals and whatever lay beyond. Jarnulf smiled and went back inside to prepare for another day of the work that would define the rest of his life, not as exile or warrior, but as guardian of the space where mercy and justice met.